Bertrand, Charlotte, it's a pleasure to be on stage with both of you today. And let me tell the audience a little bit about you. Bertrand Bodson is Chief Digital Officer of Novartis. As you know, a leading medicines company powered by advanced therapy platforms and data science. Charlotte Lindsey is the Director of Digital Transformation and Data at the ICRC, the International Committee of the Red Cross, which I learned during the process of preparing for this panel is a 156-year-old organization with the mandate internationally to protect and assist people affected by conflict. So the Red Cross is a movement, but the ICRC is the international mandated arm of it. That's right. And it's really a pleasure to have you both here today, and I would like to open this conversation by taking a look at how do we apply digital transformation to complex organizations. This is something that both of you are currently working on, and it would be wonderful for the organization to understand when you started on your present journey, what was your mindset? What were some of the assumptions you've had? And did they pan out as you assumed, or did you have to pivot and make changes along the way? Perhaps we start with you, Bertrand.
Sure. Definitely a topic close to my heart. I think probably, how did I feel at first? Probably a mix of excited, a mix of on the journey of being humbled pretty strongly afterwards, and now really in the spirit of scaling. So what I mean by that is excited by the opportunity of convergence that you get between technology, science, and data starting to really coming together. I think this is a moment, this is really a moment in time where we have chances to do what Gisbert was talking about, that is becoming real and at a certain scale right now. Humbled by coming from the tech industry from before, having probably over-assumed that just apply data science to it is going to be a computational challenge, especially with the powers we have now. But actually, back to probably a century ago, we still understand only a fraction of biology as such. So there's a very humble side to that. And I think now probably in the phase of scaling, which is the pharma industry is known for doing a lot of things in data and digital, but at pilot level, where we test our way, we try, it's a feel-good factor, but we don't scale very well. Mm-hmm. So now one of the big ambitions I definitely want to take on with the teams are how do we scale this really to a level that it sticks and it really completely changed the ways of working. I think Gisbert touched on it, and we're getting on the verge of that right now.
That's great. Charlotte?
Thank you. So I think for the ICRC, so as you said, an organization that works in situations of conflict and violence, certainly bringing digital transformation into an organization like that is not the first area that anybody joins the ICRC to talk about. I mean, it really is about how we respond to the needs of victims of conflict and violence. And so really trying to introduce this notion of digitalization and explain what that meant for the organization was quite an interesting journey for us as an organization. As you say, 156 years old, most people will say this is not relevant for our response today. So what was really critical was to connect this to the work that we were doing in the field and to make this about the ways that behaviors of people were changing, the ways that we need to be able to deliver programs in the future. The relevance of our organization was intimately connected to our ability to transform digitally. And so it was that once that journey and the explanations had been outlaid, it was then looking at, do we want to have a vision that drives us forward, or do we want our legacy to be the starting point for what our strategy is? And I think that was an interesting dialogue inside the organization, because we're all legacy organizations. 156 years of legacy is a strong one. The culture is very strong in the organization. So it was really trying to connect and say, where is the vision? Where do we want to be? And certainly in my role over the previous decade, if there was one thing I learned about technology, is that we generally overestimate what we can do in 2 years and we underestimate what we can do in 10. So the aim was to say, well, what's it going to look like from the perspective of a humanitarian organization in 10 years' time? Let's take some presumptions and let's look at what the implications of that might be, because the increments of what we might build over 2 years would be very different. And so it was really looking and elaborating that vision, connecting it to the work of the organization that really spoke to people, because it was about the needs and the relevance of our work, and then building a vision that would help people identify where we were trying to go.
Both of you have talked about the importance of understanding that in an organization with legacy, with history, and also in your case, working with the health of patients, that you've had to really think about digital transformation in that context. I mean, certainly the culture of your organization also plays a major role in this. There's a lot of know-how, there's a lot of knowledge, and also an awareness and concern about what is ultimately affecting the patient, ultimately affecting those in conflict situations. So could you elaborate a little bit on how you believe your organization's culture plays a role in your digital transformation? How is it owned by that culture and transformed also by that culture?
Massively. I think if I look at my job, probably half of my time is really spent on cultural transformation. It's really, literally, it's half of it in terms of recruiting, in terms of who do we bring on board, in terms of how do we break down the teams and get into proper product teams at a scale that really matters. We have, but I think it's more than that. It's more than data and digital. It's also the entire organization in its own right. In my place, we have a movement that we call the Unboss movement happening right now, where we are really trying to unboss the organization, which is not easy to do when you have 100,000 people incredibly naturally curious. And how do you raise that curiosity? How do you inspire much more? But how do we empower those teams to really go after what they can do? I would argue, actually, you talk about legacy, there is something that doesn't resonate with me because we're probably one of the most innovative type of companies that exist. We spend 10 billion per year in R&D. For at the end of the day, Gisbert put it well, for 3,500 drugs total all over time that have ever come to fruition. So we are very risk-taking to some extent, but how do we unleash that? So that Unboss movement is a big part of what we have too. With the exec team, I think we're pushing that and making that very real. We're also trying to change the dialogue. Like last week, for example, we had what we call the Novartis Leadership Forum. It's a top 300 coming together for 3 days. Usually you would expect probably to have much more strat plan type of discussions, portfolio reviews. We decided to put that completely on the side and to have 3 days entirely dedicated to data and digital and the cultural dimension that are behind. It's quite a symbol. It's quite a strength. We invited 12 provocateurs from the Amazon, Microsoft, Google, from biotechs, from hospitals, partners of ours as well, to really provoke us, to push the boundaries of what it can look like and what we can do on that front. So you can sense I feel very passionate about that. I think we live it via our Unboss movement, and I think our data and digital transformation probably is one of the anchors on which we are putting that on.
And the Unboss movement, it sounds very interesting. Is this an invitation for individual contributors to bring their ideas forth? How does it feed into your digital transformation? So it's
more
very
than
interesting.
that. So we're trying to raise curiosity and inspiration in the organization, but also empowerment. So that doesn't mean anarchy. It means that there's a tennis court and there are rules around the tennis court, rules of the game and lines. But within that, it's a big recognition that an organization like ours cannot be a know-it-all. It really needs to be a learn-it-all. And how do you bring disciplines like machine learners, data wranglers, bench scientists, engineering all together really, and to want to collaborate much, much more as they should, as they want to operate as well in that. So that's the spirit we're trying to create. On a personal level, I mean, I work for Vas Narasimhan, who is our CEO. We're roughly the same age. I think over a year and a half, he has never asked me anything specific to do. It gives us the ammunition to go after it and then empowers us to really go after it and break the silos.
Oh, that is really interesting. And you were also mentioning earlier that you're always keeping an eye out for how does your digital transformation story fit with the ultimate benefit to impacted people. So your organization, clearly all of the members of your organization are, every single thing that they do can and probably does in some way impact that ultimate outcome. So just as Bertrand was talking about the Unboss movement, or initiative, how is your organization approaching cultural transformation? What are some of the things you're doing to make sure that that culture and the ultimate outcome are aligned together digitally?
Like Bertrand mentioned, I think the culture is the critical piece. And I think everybody in the organization believes change is important. most of the time people think somebody else should change. And so there is an enormous element about how you yourself have to change. I think there's a lot of fear and anxiety around digitalization and data because people don't really understand. Every other email is about a blockchain or data analytics. And so people are concerned about, are they able to adapt to that change? Are they still part of the vision of an organization? And I think what is even more critical in an organization like the ICSC, which has such a strong purpose driver behind it, when you have a humanitarian purpose and people who join because they are so committed to going and working in the most extreme environments in order to bring protection and assistance to victims of conflict, that is such a strong driver. Any change that you want to bring in has to be able to meet the challenge. Is it going to make our work better? Is it going to be able to respond better to needs? Is it going to make us a more effective organization? And so I think that driver, you have to have a vision that's compelling enough and anchored to the organization. And then you have to recognize cultural journeys do not happen overnight. And that those changes are intimately linked to how people see their own future inside an organization. I'm a firm believer that you have to bring the people with you in the organization. You can't change them all, especially in an organization which works in extreme environments. And the other aspect that you mentioned, collaboration, it's critical. Interestingly enough, actually, we brought the Novartis CEO into the ICSC a month ago to talk about the UNBOSS, to talk about cultural change. What can we learn from other organizations? Because we are actually all on a very, very similar journey. We all have enormous expectations internally and externally. And so what can we learn from others? How can we help ourselves along the journey to see what might be coming, to be a learning organization, and to recognize that actually, it's not really about technology, it's fundamentally about people. And how do we bring, whether it's internal or external, how do we bring people with us?
How has that journey how has that journey moved forward in your experience? What are some of the highlights? Both of you have been on this path for a while, and what would you say has really made you happy to say, yes, this is the right direction?
I think it's hard and incredibly rewarding at the same time. It's hard because it's a daily battle. As you say, it's moving mountains as well as part of it. It's the piece we tend to, I think, many of us underestimate is how much demystifications need to happen. As soon as you get into a space, people assume you're going to come up with digital technology and it's going to be fixed, and it's that department that takes care of it. Versus we're really trying to change the mindset of, no, it's the 100,000 of us that really need to go after it, plus where are the right partners who can help us get on that journey as well as part of it. But again, to me, when you see some of the big lighthouses, some of the big programs we take on, or starting to really go and scale, and when you see thousands of users internally whose life is being made easier and they can spend time where they really should spend time. When we see our drugs, like I was talking earlier today about Aimovig, one of our migraine drugs, and you start seeing getting in the hands of hundreds of thousands of patients and demystifying what disease is all about thanks to digital channels and novel channels, that's very rewarding as well. When you see, like last week, 300 champions, where you ultimately are making the calls on most of the P&L within Novartis. All of it happens in that room, and they're hard calls to be made because you have to change the ways of working to reallocate budget resources differently. That's rewarding as well to me. And probably more importantly than any of it, and I think that image on the screen probably captures the purpose, Charlotte, you were talking about, is there is a sense of action that I found, having worked in other industry, that is stronger in this space than anywhere else. Here it's a leprosy patient on which people don't know that. It's a biblical disease. We would expect it to be eradicated. But it's still 200,000 new patients every single year, 80% of them in India and Brazil, Indonesia. And it's still being treated by checking with the doctor remotely if there is some nerve damage with all the stigma behind. Surely data and technology can help. So in that case, we're working with Microsoft to help us analyze huge amounts of training data sets to understand with basic skin lesion, can you really understand what the pattern could be, so that from a basic smartphone, you could see fairly early on to detect before nerve damage happens, can you do something about that? that's rewarding. But it requires some hard course. It's like you cannot do it all over the planet in all dimensions, otherwise you dilute yourself too thin. So that's a tough piece, is how do you galvanize the teams, but how do you say no a heck of a lot to be able to get a few rewarding ones?
That's right, really to narrow down the focus to certain key areas and then a ripple effect from there on out. What keeps you up at night in terms of the cultural transformation piece? Where do you feel like this really is the linchpin upon which everything else depends?
Many things. I think there are a few right now that are really bugging me. One is the move from pilot to scale. So we're investing massively on that. So having to say no a lot to be able to take the real foundations. I think transformations is more than, often we talk about it in the soft terms and culture as well, but it's the hard cores of how do you build the right architecture, the right platforms. I talked earlier this morning about the 2 million patient years of clinical trial data we have, and with Gisbert we talked about that. That's a jewel, a gold mine of data that we have with a lot of knowledge around patients longitudinally from a genomic point of view, the phenotypic interactions, the outcome data on the back of it. How do you really structure that data? And that data is quite tough we have never cleaned it and linked it properly as part of that. So it's all the hard work that people don't get to see to be able to do those kind of things that we talked about here.
Yeah, it's really
and I'll add
amazing.
one more, which is also talent. It's really, and that's partly the interest as well of being in those forums, hopefully to get to see what the hacking community as well comes up later in this weekend. But we need a unique set of talent to go after those kind of things that we have never before. And maybe some underappreciate the type of challenges of puzzles that we have in our space that are, I think, some of the most interesting ones in the world.
That is definitely true, because you are faced with problems that you haven't solved in quite this manner before. And new ideas, fresh blood, all of that definitely brings in something. And how do you integrate that, I suppose, then into the company that is already up and running and working on these issues and making that impact? And Charlotte and I were standing outside the stage just at the beginning of this event, and we were talking about how the work that they are doing, for instance, is really out in some of the most challenging parts of the planet, in crisis situations, working with extremely vulnerable populations. And you mentioned earlier, Charlotte, that what you're trying to do internally is build an organizational culture which is keeping those people always in mind. Can you talk a little bit about, just as Bertrand did, what have you looked back upon? What can you look back upon and say, great, we've gotten to this point?
I mean, we're really at early days in the journey of digital transformation. But I think, for me, what was very critical was having a vision that was enabling us to think about the challenges of conflict from a digital perspective. And then not only building a strategy for that, but actually getting it into the global institutional strategy as a priority for the next 4 years. So it's the fifth pillar of the ICSC's institutional strategy, because that means that it's really got the buy-in of the organization to move it forward. And I think, so that is critical. I think there are some projects that we're working on still in pilot phase, which look really exciting in terms of trying to solve some big humanitarian challenges. They will take many years for us to build, but we have started on using algorithmic reading and facial recognition technology to try to solve cases of persons who've gone missing in situations of armed conflict. And those challenges, the right to know what has happened to your family member, and then to connect that with technology, looks incredibly exciting. And we are 2 years into that work. But I think the potential to respond to something which is a massive humanitarian challenge is really important. The other area that we're really working on is how do we build not only the physical proximity that the ICSC has, but a digital proximity to people. And so virtually, where we can't reach people for security reasons, or we can't reach them, or they prefer not to approach an organization, but they could reach us digitally, and then respond to some of those challenges and aggregate the need from that perspective is very exciting. And we've started working on pilots to do that. The things that keep me awake at night are probably very similar. Scale, piloting to scale.
Yeah.
And how do you take that step? That is a learning journey for any organization. And the other key area for me is around security and digital risk. and data literacy. I think that we've been doing a lot of work trying to understand what are the risks for individuals through the use of technology. But also, how do we as an organization ensure that we have a responsible approach to the use of technologies so that we don't do any harm? And I think that those things, continually you are balancing between the opportunities that technology provides and the risks that come associated with that.
I mean, both of you have talked about some of the places where you're placing your resources, as well as thinking about how to deliver impact and scale, not just thinking, but doing on a daily basis, and how it is definitely a learning journey as well as a doing journey as you over time. I think both of you have used very powerful metaphors, this image, and talking about how big data could be used to remotely treat leprosy, which is absolutely an incredible gift to give to somebody who is suffering. And to be able to do that and be in that position, I think is a goal that would enthuse me, were I a member of an organization such as yours. And the same goes definitely for the ICRC as well. It's very inspiring, the work that you do and how you do it. Could you maybe share with this audience a little bit about, and you both brought up talent, you both said how important it is for you to find the right people with the right skill and the right mindset to come and work with you in this journey. What are you looking for in terms of, let's say, a young digital professional wanted to explore working in your organizations? What would your message to them be?
Mm-hmm.
To me, it would be, I'm looking for bilinguals.
Okay.
So people who are comfortable. I mean, this is not for the faint-hearted, and what you do at the Red Cross is incredibly, the sense of purpose is incredible, but it requires a certain type of people to go after that. And by bilinguals, I mean non-faint-hearted, who are comfortable with all the paradoxes in our space as well, where you have to be humbled by biology, but you have to keep pushing and to get new fields into it to try to find new ways, as was described before. People who are comfortable with the ambiguity of big organizations and being a P&L, and at the same time making sure that we give massive access to the world, being fairly ambitious in the sense of when seeing that picture of saying, how can we think differently about leprosy, or about sickle cell disease, about malaria, and go and do our bit to go and eradicate those diseases. And bilingual in the sense as well of, I think it's that time now, where people who can speak different languages, who can speak tech and who can speak science and who can speak data, who can speak bioinformatics, who can speak machine learning, who can speak actually lab scientists as well. So those are a rare breed. Some who are from an engineering background, but really interested in terms of the silicon chip that Gisbert was talking about earlier today, about how can you try things differently. And then we're comfortable to merge it all together. So to get those teams who unboss themselves, who don't need the same traditional hierarchical framework, which is not easy. It's easy to say on stage, it's very difficult to do in practice, and it's difficult for the individuals as well, because you don't get the absolute clear sense of directions. You have a framework and a sense of directions, but then you're an entrepreneur with your different skills, you bring those together and then magic happens. Those are rare breeds. So those bilinguals are the ones we're really going around the world to try to find and bring on board.
Very interesting that you mentioned the word bilingual, because I'll use a personal anecdote here. My daughter speaks Swiss German as her native language. My husband is Swiss, and she also is learning French, and she speaks English through me. It's very interesting to see how when she goes to the US, I mean, I noticed that, she was playing soccer with a couple of boys, friends of our kids of our friends, and there was one boy that thought he was very, very good at soccer, and he was explaining to her the rules of the game and so on.